So we're taking a look at Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Yeah.
It's an incredible book, really.
Absolutely.
It's a psychiatrist
Yeah.
who went through the unimaginable awfulness of being a prisoner
Right.
in Nazi concentration camps.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just like a regular book. This is like serious stuff. For anyone who's listening, who's going through maybe their own struggles and their own really difficult times, it offers a really unique perspective.
And I think it's important to point out that Frankl's insights, they're not like abstract theories.
Right.
They're rooted in his personal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And what's really interesting about the book is how he weaves those two things together. Like, he's a psychiatrist,
Yeah.
but he's also drawing on his own lived experience.
Mm-hmm. And for listeners, too, who might be thinking about, the weight that we give to different expert opinions, the fact that he went through this himself gives, an extra layer of validity to his perspective.
Exactly.
And the central idea here that I think is so powerful is this idea of the will to meaning.
Right.
And this is really like the heart of logotherapy, which is what he developed out of this experience.
Yeah.
And you can think of logotherapy as the third Viennese school of psychotherapy. So you had Freud, you had Adler, and then Frankl comes along and he's sort of adding to that. But really with this distinct focus on meaning as this primary drive.
Yeah.
So for listeners, maybe if you're familiar with Freud, it's all about pleasure.
Right.
Maybe if you're familiar with Adler, it's all about power. Frankl is coming in and saying, no, the most fundamental drive as human beings is this search for meaning.
That's right.
And especially in the face of suffering, that's when it really comes to the fore.
Yeah. And logotherapy really posits, this search for meaning, it's the primary motivation in our lives. And what's so fascinating is that Frankl's experience in the concentration camps, like that was the ultimate testing ground for this idea.
I think, as we talk about this today, it's helpful to keep in mind the personal narrative, but also the psychological framework that he's developing.
Yeah, and how they kind of feed into each other.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with part one of the book, where he really vividly recounts his experiences in a concentration camp. And, he talks about like just the sheer shock of arrival, right? Like immediate loss of everything, dehumanization.
Being reduced to a number.
Yeah.
Even his own life's work, which was this manuscript that he had been working on, it was just dismissed as worthless.
Right.
Listeners, just imagine that for a second, like this sudden stripping away of identity and possessions and everything that you've been working towards.
It's hard to even fathom.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does that do to your sense of self? It's a really interesting point.
The psychological impact of that was just immense.
Yeah.
Frankl describes this kind of sequence of reactions.
Yeah.
You have this initial shock, right? Like you're entering this unimaginable reality. And then as a kind of self-defense mechanism, a lot of the prisoners would descend into apathy.
Right.
Which is basically like kind of emotional death.
Yeah.
Where you're just trying to shut down your feelings as a way to survive the daily horrors.
For listeners, I think that might resonate with you if you've ever faced a situation that was so overwhelming.
Right.
That you kind of like your initial response was just to shut down emotionally.
Absolutely. And beyond even that initial shock, you have this constant battle for survival. And he talks about how crucial it was to appear fit for work.
Yeah.
If you seemed weak or sick, you risked being selected, right? Becoming one of the Muslims, as they were called.
Yeah, it's a chilling term.
Yeah, and being sent to the gas chambers.
Right.
And even like basic human needs like hunger became all-consuming.
Yeah.
They were constantly preoccupied with food.
Right.
And so listeners, I think it's really sobering to think that for these people, their whole mental landscape was often dominated by, when am I going to get my next scrap of food?
Right. It's all about survival at that point.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is Frankl's observation about the resilience of the human body.
Yeah.
Even under these conditions of like extreme deprivation, lack of terrible hygiene, starvation.
Yeah.
Like people endured far more than you might think.
Right.
And he even mentions this kind of paradoxical thing where like they weren't able to clean their teeth. They had all these vitamin deficiencies.
Right.
But their gums were healthier than ever before.
Wow.
So it really makes you wonder about the limits of human endurance.
Absolutely. And even beyond, that physical struggle, he also talks about this remarkable persistence of inner life.
Yeah.
So even in that environment, memories of loved ones became so important, like a real lifeline.
Right. A connection to a former self.
Yeah. And a source of strength.
Absolutely.
And religion, too, offered solace for a lot of people. Even a sense of humor emerged as a coping mechanism.
Right, a dark sense of humor.
Yeah, really dark humor. But just this way of finding some kind of light in this incredibly dark situation.
Yeah.
And he talks very poignantly about the memory of his wife as a real source of strength.
Yeah.
So for listeners out there, think about, what are the people or the beliefs that give you that inner strength when you're going through difficult times?
Yeah, that's a powerful question. Building on this idea of inner resilience, Frankl identifies one of the most profound concepts in the book, which is this idea of the last of human freedoms.
Right.
So he's arguing that even in the face of absolute external control, we always retain this ability to choose our attitude in any given circumstance. And he saw this firsthand. Prisoners who, despite everything, chose to maintain their dignity and their inner freedom.
Yeah.
So the takeaway here for listeners is that even when it seems like external circumstances have stripped everything away, you still have this power to choose your internal response.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately where your freedom lies.
Yeah. And it seems like that's where
meaning can be found.
Meaning can be found, exactly.
Yeah.
He also talks about what he calls cultural hibernation within the camp. They were largely focused on just basic survival, but there were exceptions, right?
Yeah.
Politics was a constant topic of conversation, often based in rumors and things like that.
Right, unreliable rumors.
But nonetheless, it was something that they talked about.
Yeah.
And there was a real deepening of religious interest. So I think that kind of shows you that even in this most oppressive environment, there's still this human need for connection.
And for understanding.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's striking is how, despite physical and mental degradation that was happening in the camp, spiritual life often actually intensified.
Right. It's kind of counterintuitive.
And particularly for sensitive individuals, they seem to retreat inward.
Yeah.
And they found richness and freedom in their inner world. And he shares this really moving story about a young woman who finds solace and meaning in a single tree blossom.
Wow.
And she sees it as a symbol of life.
Yeah.
Eternal life.
Wow.
It raises this interesting question for listeners, right? Where do you find beauty and meaning, even in the midst of, mundane or challenging circumstances?
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that he really underscores is this constant fight against the camp's dehumanizing influences, like maintaining this inner hold on your moral and spiritual self.
Right. And that kind of brings us to another really key idea, which is the significance of having a future goal, like a why to live for.
Yeah.
And he quotes Nietzsche here. He who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow.
It's a powerful quote.
Yeah. So listeners, what is your why? What are those future aspirations or commitments that are driving you forward?
That are keeping you going.
It could take many forms. For Frankl himself, it was this desire to reconstruct his lost manuscript, the one that had been taken from him.
Yeah.
And that really shows you this link between belief in the future and the will to survive.
Yeah.
And it's not about what life should give to you. It's about what life demands from you.
Right.
He really stresses this uniqueness of each person's situation.
Yeah.
And the deeply personal nature of meaning, especially in suffering. He has this great quote from Rilke.
Yeah.
Wie viel ist aufzuleiden, which means how much there is to suffer.
Wow, yeah.
And so, for listeners, I think that kind of shifts the focus from what you expect from life to what you can offer and what responsibilities you hold.
That's a good point. In the face of all this suffering, there were these, both individual and collective attempts at what we might call psychotherapy within the camp. And a lot of it was really focused on preventing suicide by reminding people of something or someone in the future who needed them or depended on them. It could be a child unfinished work, a loved one.
Right.
And I think what's fascinating about that is this idea that human connection and responsibility can be such a powerful antidote to despair.
Yeah, absolutely. He also interestingly reflects on the psychological makeup of the camp guards, and he observed a spectrum of behavior. He notes that even among them, there were some rare instances of decency.
Wow.
And that led him to this, really profound realization that the line between good and evil, it's not between groups of people. It exists within every single human being. So listeners, I think that's a really sobering thought.
It is.
It kind of makes you reflect on the complexities of human nature.
Yeah.
So moving on to part 2 of the book.
Okay.
He really lays out these core principles of logotherapy in a more structured way.
Yeah.
And as we've been talking about, the central tenet is the will to meaning.
Right.
As this primary driving force in human life.
And I think what's really important for listeners to understand is that this isn't just like some abstract philosophical concept.
Right.
He's presenting it as a fundamental human need.
Right. Like we need food, water, shelter.
Right.
And we need meaning.
We need meaning, exactly.
Yeah. And he introduces this concept of existential frustration, which is, the frustration of this will to meaning.
Yeah.
And he distinguishes this from traditional psychogenic neuroses,
Right.
which are rooted in psychological conflicts. So existential frustration can lead to what he calls noonatogenic neuroses, which originate in this noonatological dimension. So that's essentially like our capacity for meaning. You can think of it this way. Like a psychogenic neurosis might come from like a past trauma or some unresolved conflict, but a noogenic neurosis is coming from this feeling that your life lacks purpose.
Right.
Even if you don't have any like obvious psychological wounds.
Right.
And
it's not just about, conflicts between drives or instincts or whatever.
Yeah.
It's really arising from these existential problems, this failure to find meaning and a sense of responsibility in your existence.
Yeah.
And Frankl argues that in these cases, logotherapy, which addresses this specifically human dimension, is the appropriate form of therapy.
Right.
It makes you think, have you ever experienced those feelings of emptiness or aimlessness?
And he talks about this new dynamics, which is this healthy tension that exists between what we've already achieved and what we still ought to accomplish.
Okay.
And this is contrasted with the idea of homeostasis.
Right.
Which is like a tensionless state.
Yeah, like this idea that you just want to be totally chilled out and relaxed all the time.
Yeah, and Frankl's saying, no.
Yeah.
Like this striving for meaning, this healthy tension is actually essential for well-being.
Right.
So for listeners, that might suggest that a certain level of striving and purpose-driven tension might actually be a sign of mental health.
Interesting.
Not something to be avoided.
And this lack of meaning, it can lead to what Frankl calls the existential vacuum.
Right.
Which is this pervasive feeling of inner emptiness and meaninglessness.
And he suggests that, this was really widespread in the 20th century, potentially stemming from the loss of, on the one hand, like the security of animal instincts, and on the other hand, like the diminishing influence of tradition. So people are kind of left without these clear guides on what to do or even what they wish to do. And this often manifests as boredom. So it's not just a modern malaise, this feeling of emptiness.
Yeah.
It's really a fundamental human experience when our drive for meaning isn't being fulfilled.
It's like this nagging sense of boredom or restlessness.
Yeah, exactly.
So what is logotherapy's role?
Well, he explains that it's really about helping the patient become aware of the hidden logos, right? The inherent meaning in their existence.
Okay.
So the focus shifts from simply satisfying drives or adjusting to society to actively fulfilling this unique personal meaning.
Right. So it's not about conforming external expectations.
Right.
It's about discovering your own potential.
Yeah.
For meaning.
And crucially, logotherapy emphasizes this possibility of finding meaning even in suffering. And he argues that suffering is an unavoidable part of life.
Right.
But it can also be an opportunity for inner growth and for finding deeper meaning.
Absolutely.
So it's not the suffering itself.
Right.
But our attitude toward unavoidable suffering that matters.
Exactly. And he uses examples like Jerry Long, who is a quadriplegic, who found profound meaning in his life, despite these immense physical challenges.
Yeah. So, that just shows you that even in the face of, significant hardship, the human spirit can find purpose and meaning.
Absolutely.
And he also addresses what he calls the tragic triad, suffering, guilt, and death.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
Yeah, and logotherapy doesn't shy away from those.
Right. It's not about pretending they don't exist.
He talks about this idea of tragic optimism.
Right.
Which is maintaining hope and meaning even in the face of these inherent tragedies.
That's a powerful idea.
Yeah, kind of encourages this perspective that acknowledges these difficult realities of life, but still holds on to hope and purpose. You know, he really emphasizes individual responsibility, and he rejects this concept of collective guilt.
Right.
So each person is responsible for finding and fulfilling their own meaning.
He also highlights the transitoriness of life, not as something to be feared, but as a reminder to make the most of each moment. And he talks about these granaries of the past, emphasizing that what we've experienced and achieved holds this irrevocable value.
Yeah.
You know, so for listeners, it's about taking ownership of your life, recognizing the lasting impact of your experiences.
Right. And ultimately, you know, he posits this unconditional meaning of life, at least potentially.
Right.
And the unconditional value and dignity of every single person, regardless of their circumstances.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah, so that's a really powerful message, that your life inherently has meaning and value simply because you exist.
And then finally, in the postscript, the case for tragic optimism.
Right.
He really reiterates logotherapy's central focus on finding meaning even in suffering, and the importance of maintaining our humanity in dehumanizing conditions. You know, he's really driving that point home.
Absolutely. And he points to empirical evidence, you know, like studies of Vietnam War POWs. Many of them reported that their captivity, despite the horrors, actually became a growth experience.
Wow.
You know, so that suggests that even experiences that we might perceive as purely negative
can actually hold these unexpected opportunities for personal growth and discovery.
Yeah, and he also highlights this defiant power of the human spirit.
Yeah.
You know, showcasing individuals who face these immense challenges, but they do it with this strong sense of purpose.
Right.
So again, it kind of underscores that human capacity to transcend even the most dire circumstances.
Yeah, if you're driven by a sense of meaning.
Yeah. He also returns to this problem of the existential vacuum.
Right.
You know, noting its connection to things like depression, aggression, addiction.
Yeah.
And he really emphasizes that addressing this feeling of meaninglessness is crucial for mental health.
Yeah.
So for listeners, recognizing and addressing any feelings of emptiness or lack of purpose could be really vital for your well-being.
Absolutely.
And in the context of suicide prevention, he highlights this logotherapeutic approach of reminding individuals that life still expects something from them. You know, that there's still a meaning to be found and to be fulfilled.
And that can be so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really.
So as we kind of wrap up this look at man's search for meaning, what are some of the key takeaways for you?
Well, I think the most powerful messages for me are first, that fundamental human drive for meaning. And then second, this incredible capacity we have as individuals to discover meaning, even amidst suffering.
Right.
And then finally, the importance of choice in shaping your attitude towards whatever life throws your way.
It really is a message of hope.
It is.
And a testament to this incredible resilience.
And how can you actively seek and create meaning within your own life? Regardless of the challenges you face.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a really powerful conversation.
Yeah, it has.
Thank you for joining us for this examination of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Stay curious, expand your mind.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye.
Thank you so much for your like. Please consider subscribing to our channel to keep discovering fascinating aspects of our minds, spirits, and existence.